Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. I'm Isaac Bradley, Director of Financial Planning for Hamrickberg, and I'll be moderating today's conversation around family vacation homes. We'll be following up with an article covering what we just discussed today. Also, many of you submitted questions as part of the registration process. Today's conversation will hopefully cover most of those, but advisors will follow up on some of the specific questions. I'm joined today by our panelists, Abby Flaum, a family wealth strategist in our Atlanta, Georgia office, and three of our advisors, including Amy Owen in Palm Beach, Florida, Kelly Nowotnick and Chad Norfolk, who are both in our Towson, Maryland office. Today, we're going to be discussing some of the issues and considerations around owning a family vacation home. This applies to families who share the use of a vacation home and other properties like a family farm. The family could also have shared, or the family could have shared ownership, but it could also be still owned by the matriarch or patriarch, but being used by multiple family members across even generations. Vacation homes can sometimes make up a fairly significant portion of a family's balance sheet, and there are financial issues that we're going to be discussing today. But vacation homes are a really unique asset in that the value often isn't what's shown on the balance sheet. Vacation homes are places where families deepen relationships, where memories are made, and where family values get passed down from generation to generation. For some, the vacation home may not just be the place where your kids are learning to swim. It may also be the place where your mom or dad learned to swim. We don't always, as financial advisors, do a great job of addressing the non-financial aspects of assets like this. But given the significant emotional value and connection that can be associated with a family vacation home, it's really critical to have these conversations. And so that's what we're going to be talking about today. The panelists today have all dealt with this across multiple clients and have tremendous experience. And the topics that we're going to be covering are going to include one, a discussion around the family's vision and the importance of really understanding each family member's expectations with regards to the vacation home. Two is putting governance in place around the decision-making and management of the home's use. Three is addressing maintenance issues, including expenses and oversight. And finally, considering transfer planning and exit considerations when family members need or desire to maybe exit the ownership. So to start, my first question, Chad, this is going to be for you. Understanding a family's intent or vision and each family member's expectations is essential. It's really the foundation of this. But the thought of having this type of a discussion can create anxiety in a lot of families. So how do you help families facilitate these conversations?
Great, thanks, Isaac. I'd first start with just talking a little bit about my colleagues at HB and the fact that I'm on this panel with four former practicing attorneys. We just have a wonderful ecosystem here because I'm not going to have all the answers. And it's wonderful that I can bring a colleague, partner into that conversation. So I'd first start with the fact that we usually have two or three of us kind of in the back room brainstorming, but often in the meeting with the family, which is extremely helpful. And it helps everybody kind of see all angles and all sides. But we normally find ourselves kind of in a position with the matriarch or patriarch of the family. They're usually the financial backers of the home. They dreamed of owning a second home as a central gathering place for their adult children and grandchildren. And we just try to help them turn the dream into a reality. And limit the bumps along the way. So that process typically starts with building a financial model. We found it's always best practice to start with that model. It removes emotion. It helps just set the table from the start. So we start with that model, kind of short-term, long-term forecasting. There's different levels of complexity depending on if we're buying an existing home or building a new home. Building that home can uh, bring the family together and really involve the adult children in many cases as they're planning what we often call and hope for to be a forever home. So it can really be a binding experience for the family. But we help navigate all of those facets. And this process just helps us to start being proactive. So many families keep score with money. So many people keep score with money. So by just breaking down the walls and involving the family in that financial model, and really thinking about the short and the long-term costs of the home, we really find it to be a unifying experience. The other thing that we found over the years, especially working with first generation wealth, is the vacation home is oftentimes the first signal of wealth to the next generation. Mom and dad maybe buy this home, build this home, and it's the first experience. Wow, we have this cabin, we have this beach house. We're bringing our friends, we're bringing our spouses to the home, and oftentimes the tab is picked up, and everybody just goes and enjoys the home. And it's just the first step in to, hey, there's wealth here, and it's a bit of the unveiling from mom and dad to the children. So we try to use that as an opportunity to just open communication, just again start building that bridge, start creating that dialogue, start teaching that skill for the next generation. So again, first step is just building that financial model and trying to break down walls and really plan ahead. I'd say the second step is really starting to hone in on creating shared values around the home. You might call that the family charter for the home, value statement. But again, just trying to create alignment with shared values. Oftentimes, family togetherness is a common starting point as a shared value. Um, you know, Families often talk about, hey, we want to be present when we're in the home, put the phones down, things like that, all kind of shape that family togetherness. The other thing that we often see is just trying from the start to share responsibility. So it could be things like maintenance for the home. There's a joke we often say that, with a normal a rental car, nobody washes the car before they turn it back in. Well, you don't want that for the family vacation home. You want whoever's leaving to leave it in better condition than when they came there. And that goes for cleanliness, but that also goes for future improvements to the home, especially if you want it to be a multi-generational home. Another shared value is quality. And it's really for us trying to educate everyone to a mindset that there's no perfect structure. And Abby and Amy and Kelly are going to talk a lot about structure, but there isn't a perfect structure. We need to communicate, and we need the children to accept that there's going to be inequalities and difficulties sometimes in keeping things equal. So we just kind of put it on the board and address it right out of the gate. Simplicity is another value we often try to focus on, thinking ahead, because ultimately we want this to be something that transfers and is easy for the next generation. It's not hard. So a lot of that planning up front, sometimes talking about sustainability, creating a fund that's going to carry the home. These are all things we kind of weave into that statement high level, not always getting into the weeds. And then the flexibility, for children on different coasts, what's going to happen down the road. We can't anticipate who somebody selects as their partner, and if that works out. We don't know if one child is going to do better financially than another. So again, trying to plan ahead for flexibility, because each individual, each family is going to use the home a little differently. And then ultimately, it's just about communicating. So that's our job, is to step into our client's shoes and try to create that method of communication. We don't want people to get stuck. So those are all kind of the tenets that we try to weave in when we get started with this project with our families.
Thanks, Chad. And so having the conversation is such an important aspect. And then from there, it's important to somehow memorialize that, right? To put an agreement in place so that going forward, the family knows sort of what everyone's agreed to. So how do you take that conversation and put it into something that then is memorialized and that the family can reference back to and has some sort of obligation around it?
Yeah, this is a great segue for me to kind of throw it into my ecosystem of partners and colleagues on the phone and really talk about structure. So Abby's going to take the first stab at that, and Amy and Kelly are going to kind of weave in and out as we think about things like liability, estate tax mitigation, transferability, risk management. All these things are really critical when we think about this home and our job of trying to see around the corner and help our clients anticipate the potential pitfalls. So from here, I'll just go ahead and turn it over to Abby.
Okay, thanks, Chad. Thanks, Isaac. I have to say that having just left law practice a few years ago, this is all still fresh in my mind. And I know there's probably at least a few people that have logged on today that said, family vacation homes. I like my vacation home. Maybe I should log in and see, what they have to say. Maybe I'll make sure it's there for several generations. And what I would tell you is that when I was in practice and I had clients that would say, I want to put my vacation home in a trust or an LLC, and we're going to talk about all of the structures. I would really probe them and see if it's the right thing for their family, because you can even tell from Chad's introduction and all of the various topics we're going to scramble to cover in this hour. There is so much complexity involved, whether it's your ski chalet in Colorado, your beach house in Florida, your lake house in North Carolina, whatever it is, there is a lot to plan for, and you're trying to plan to ensure that your family is harmonious and everything is well managed. We don't want them getting to the lake house and throwing each other in the lake or throwing each other off the ski slopes. We want everyone getting along, and that's usually the goal of the family vacation home. To talk about ownership structures, I think there's a consensus amongst those of us on this call about the ownership structures that we generally like to see. And I want to say that this is definitely something that we determine on a case-by-case basis. No two individuals and no two vacation homes are alike. So we really need to analyze the home, the creator, the owner of the vacation home, the intent for the family, in order to determine the correct structure and work with the attorneys and CPAs to implement everything. But I'm going to talk about the common ownership structures that I've seen and where we generally like to see those conversations go. First, I really want to mention joint ownership. And there's two, and in some states, three forms of joint ownership. The first is joint tenancy with rights of survivorship. Also, in some states, there's another form of this called tenancy by the entirety reserved to spouses. That's not in Georgia, but in Florida, for example, they have it. But regardless, joint tenancy with rights of survivorship means that all of the owners who are on the deed own the property together. And if one owner dies, automatically the other owner's own the property. No probate required, no administration of trust required, just as a function of title. So I'm not married, but let's say I'm married to George Clooney and he and I own a ginormous mansion together. I said, why are you smiling? And George and I own a ginormous mansion. Well, if we title our ginormous mansion as Abby and George as joint tenants with rights of survivorship, that means that the moment I die, George owns our entire ginormous mansion just in his name. This is great because it avoids probate. It's simple to set up. It's just a deed, but there are some cons, and I'm going to talk about that in just a moment. First, I want to address tenancy in common. It's another form of joint ownership, but unlike joint tenancy with rights of survivorship, where all of the owners own the whole property, tenancy in common means each owner owns a portion of the property. So if George and I own that ginormous mansion as tenants in common, maybe our ownership in the property is commensurate with our contributions to the property. So maybe George owns 99% and Abby Flam owns 1% of the ginormous mansion. Also, there's flexibility with ownership percentages, and both a pro and a con is each owner has the ability in their own estate plan to say how their percentage ownership in the property is going to pass. But that could be a con as well. For example, maybe George Clooney does not want to co-own the ginormous mansion with my 2 children. That could be setting the whole family up for difficulty. And, with joint ownership, owners have equal rights to the property, regardless of the share size, even if it's a tenancy in common. There could be disagreements about the usage or maintenance of the property. With tenancy in common, you might have a tenancy in common agreement, but more often than not, people just don't want to do it. There's no centralized management for dispute resolution, unless the owners, create an agreement. But again, I have not seen that very often. And if a joint owner gets divorced, is sued, goes bankrupt, there could be potential exposure to creditors. So what I'm trying to say about joint ownership is that in certain circumstances, oftentimes with a married couples often will own their home as joint tenants with rights of survivorship or tenancy by the entirety. There are circumstances where joint ownership may be appropriate, but when it comes to what I think we're really focused on here for purposes of this webinar, which is a vacation home to last for several generations, joint ownership is probably not the right avenue to pursue. So I want to talk about a few other structures that people might consider. One, just to mention it, is a qualified personal residence trust. It's a tax leveraged way to ultimately pass a home or vacation home onto family members. And that might sound great, tax leveraging, except there's a lot of restrictions and different things to comply with. And before we hopped on, we were all saying, the former attorneys in practice were just saying, we haven't seen a lot of people who were thrilled that they implemented this QPERT, but there are instances where it's appropriate. So again, it's something you analyze on a case-by-case basis. In the interest of time, I do want to talk about the 2 avenues that I think we'll focus our energy on today, and talk at a very high level that I know Amy and Kelly will drill down a little further into. And those structures are limited liability companies and trusts. And whenever I would have a legal client, when I was in law practice, come to me and discuss a family vacation home and its transition for the family, and when we agreed that that was an appropriate thing to do, we would either put the home in an LLC, a limited liability company or partnership, or a trust. The great thing about having an LLC or a trust is you can tailor the agreement that governs how everything is going to work in a very specific and detailed manner to try to prevent conflict, talk about usage, scheduling, repairs, rentals, all those kinds of things. You can designate a manager or a trustee in those kinds of structures to ultimately be the tiebreaker or make the decisions. Ownership in an LLC can be divided up into units. There can be some liability protection associated with both the LLC and with the trust. Trust can help to avoid probate and also can be funded to ensure that all of the expenses are covered. With both structures, while they're both potentially very good structures for ownership of a vacation home, something to keep in mind is that both the trust agreement and the LLC operating agreement need to be drafted with care, with consideration of families' goals, and to be very precise in addressing all of the various issues that could arise with home ownership to try to prevent any friction arising in the family. And also they should be drafted with some flexibility to allow for changes as a family changes over time. I think in the interest of moving on, it's probably time to dive a little deeper into that. So Isaac, I'm going to kick that back to you.
Thank you, Abby. Thank you. You covered a tremendous amount there. And it does sound like if you want to leave a vacation home to your family and make it last for generations, then leaving it jointly, either with right of survivorship or tenants in common, is a good way to make sure that probably does not happen.
That's right.
So leaving it in trust or leaving it through an LLC structure really gives you the ability to put those that guidance around the management of the home and the decision making. Amy, I'm going to ask you the next question, and this is kind of in that line of what key items need to be addressed in looking at the management of the home, looking at the usage, and what are kind of the best practices that you've seen in working with clients?
Thanks, Isaac. Well, I think the biggest issue is the money. That's definitely the topic that comes up more than anything else. But we're going to handle that. We're going to talk about that a little bit later when we talk more about maintenance. But when I think about other issues that spotted, I remember a family that I worked with several years ago, and Dad just gave his house to his 3 kids. He did exactly what Abby just told us not to do, where he created a tenants in common, but he was still living in the house. So he's living in the master bedroom. He's got free access to the house. He's basically, paying rent, I guess, because he's paying all the expenses still. Although I don't think they would have ever evicted him. But everybody got along because Dad was there to play peacemaker. And, they actually used a Google Calendar, and they would all, sort of respect each other's, first come, first serve sort of treatment. But we all saw this as just trouble, headed down the road. And so we worked with them and implored them to sit down and talk with each other, as Chad was suggesting that, we do when he started the call, create a partnership, put that kind of operating agreement in place, and then really drill down into, what their plans were for this house. I think that when we were talking about usage of the house, that's what kind of came up. It was like those first set of initial questions that we wanted to make sure that they understood. Were there any holidays that were particularly important to any one particular person? Was there any week during the year that was traditionally that child's week when they definitely wanted to be there every week? Was there, were there going to be special occasions coming up, or was somebody going to be able to open it up for, a business event or a charity event or some, bringing other guests onto the property? I think would we actually open it up to the next generation? Would the kids be able to come and use it? Would they be able to, bring their guests into the house? All of those different usage things, down to who gets the big bedroom eventually, if more than one kid is at the house. All of those levels of detail. Those are the issues that can create hurt feelings. Those are the issues that can, cause people to really fight. And we wanted to make sure that they recognize all those issues right from the get-go. We also asked them, do we think we can do better than Google Calendar? for the scheduling? And the answer to that is yes. And we're going to talk about that in a little bit later too, when it comes to scheduling. But I think that, just really drilling down into how the family's currently using it, how they plan to use it in the future, how they're going to keep from stepping on each other's toes is crucial. And a lot of that then gets into how often are they going to check back in and make sure it's still working, and get that set up from the get-go to have regular check-ins and make sure that they know what decisions are going to be by majority, what decisions are going to be unanimous. I think that again all got into the provisions of the operating agreement that we were imploring them to put in place, because we just didn't see success in this tenants in common arrangement that Dad had foisted upon them, that we wanted them to take the intentional step of contributing their interests into an LLC and then getting that operating agreement in place. I don't know, Abby, if you've got anything to add to, those issues of collective cooperation.
I'm both a former practicing attorney, I'm a woman, I'm a New Yorker, so I'm skeptical of everyone. And I am always worried about, situations where an agreement is necessary amongst various people. I will say to the point you made, Amy, interestingly, lots of people will have a property and throw it in an LLC, and they'll co-own it with their brother and his family, and there will be no operating agreement because, hey, it's my brother, it's my nephew. Well, I've seen lots of fiduciary litigators get a lot of business off of just my brother or just my nephew, because inevitably, as Chad started talking earlier, I think money involved can sort of muddy the waters. And so it really is important to have the correct operating agreement or trust agreement. Like I said, I don't love involving multiple decision makers. My preference is to have a way to have either one committee that is by majority, or one person, maybe a trustee in the case of a trust, to make a decision to be the final decision maker. And there's ways to soften that. So for example, if we're talking about a trust that has a schedule for use for the beneficiaries, you might say the schedule is whatever the beneficiaries can decide, but that if they don't decide by a certain date each year, the trustee has the final say. So there's ways to tailor it to work for your family.
I'll add, just as not only a former practicing attorney, but also as someone who has a family beach house that's now in G2, about to move to G3. Lotteries do work well. There's lots of mechanisms that can work well, but at the end of the day, what works best is when everyone can sit around a table, look each other in the eye and say, people before things, relationship, relationship, relationship. Our relationships with each other, either as siblings, cousins, nieces, nephews, aunts, uncles, whatever, always comes first. And if you can do that, and not every family can, so there needs to be some self-awareness, but if you can do that, you're already ahead of the game.
Yeah, that's a whole different topic of family governance meetings and how to structure successful, effective family governance meetings. And a lot of that has to do with open communication, everyone having the ability to talk, etiquette, empathy, all of those good buzzwords for those family governance meetings. But it's a shared asset is one of the most fundamental reasons to have those types of meetings. So that's exactly right. I mean, as far as, I'm sorry, Isaac, were you going to ask another question?
Oh, no, go ahead, Amy, and then I'll jump in.
I think that when we do start thinking about the decisions that, need to be made, when you do start talking about usage, sometimes that does then trickle into, how the finances are going to be arranged, because when those things are identified, then you see, okay, what really is fair. Sometimes equal ownership is the way to do it. Sometimes equal responsibility is the way to do it. If it's part of the overall plan and everyone can agree to it, then that definitely has the benefit of simplicity, and equal access, and that's got its benefits. But you also then have to think about fairness and actual use and all of that. So that gets into the finances of it all, and how that gets established. I know that there's an attorney once told me, who I was working with, when we were talking about some family legacy land, assured me that the only way to guarantee that you're going to keep a house, some sort of shared family home or land or what have you in the family for generations, is to make sure there's enough money to pay for it, so that no one person ever has to dip into their own pocket to pay for the expenses of the house. So, I don't know if that's true. I'm sure there are examples of it out there where people, contribute, and then it's been very successful. But that definitely is one perspective on it. That it's maybe not how it's been done in the past when people have tried to share, homes and have things go down the generations. But I do hope it becomes more common if people want to do this. If after you've really thought it through and made sure that this is the right thing for your family, then try to figure out a way to help your kids and your grandkids finance it, because that's the way to make it a positive experience. When we haven't had that, I've seen some interesting situations, come up over the years, trying to, figure out how to help, the financing work. I actually did work on one relationship where it was the 5th generation. So this was a success. It was a real success. I mean, you're talking about a home that had stayed in the family for 5 generations. But what did that look like? And this is something to think about. If you're thinking about, well, I want my house to be here 5 generations from now, what does that actually look like 5 generations down the road? In this case, it was owned by a trust. The trustee basically gave each member of the family its own share in this sort of joint family corporation. And the share represented 1 week access to the house, which you either got to use or you got the rental that would be charged for the other weeks of the year. So that took up 25 weeks of the year. And then the other, 37 weeks of the year? I can't do math. That would be the money that would be used for maintenance of the home. So that was a really interesting way to handle the finances. It was a way to keep the property in the family. It was decided by that single decision maker, because at that point there were so many members of the family that it would just be completely unwieldy to have all the different family members having a vote. So it was a success, but at the same time, it was no longer this shared asset for families to get together and share their experiences together. So it's definitely a reason to be thinking that, are we really sure that this house is going to be in the future, and make sure you've got the right exit strategies, which we're going to talk about later. Now, for most families, though, that's not going to be the situation. You're going to have, some sort of, if you don't have that family pot of money that's there available to take care of the expenses, if you're not going to rent it out and try to cover the expenses through rentals, then what's going to happen is that everyone's going to have to chip in as things go along. I think there's right ways to do that and wrong ways to do it. A wrong way to do it might be something that one of my clients has experienced, where he gets invoiced for 25% of every bill that comes in. It's quite something. He can't even imagine why his cousin generates this much paperwork just for the management of these expenses, but that's the way she does it. But I think the key is that, to some extent, I've tried to explain to this client that we do have to have someone like your cousin in place, because when you have this shared asset and you have to figure out how to pay for it, you have to have someone there who's willing to do the bookkeeping, assess the budget, make sure you've got reserves in place, make sure that the right insurance is in place, make sure that they understand what the current expenses are and what's coming down the horizon. Have some sort of sense for what's an appropriate budget for renovations and updates on the property. All of those things have to be handled. And then once you understand, what those expenses are, you have an agreement in place that specifies when when those payments are going to be due, and when potentially what we call a capital call, which is where, in the LLC or partnership structure, you basically let all the owners know that there's an expense of the partnership that the partnership can't cover. Well, then everybody needs to contribute their fair share. Again, if everybody has an equal share of this LLC, then everyone should contribute equally. If it has been worked out so that people have unequal shares, maybe because of unequal usage or just because that's the way it worked out through the estate plan, that the different family members got different shares along the way, then you got to figure out kind of what everyone's allocation is going to be. It certainly gets complicated. And again, you sort of go back to, if you really want to do this, you probably want to try to figure out a way to help out your family with those finances. But if you can't do it, then that you're going to be in the capital call world, and then having to deal with the repercussions in case something goes wrong, i.e. somebody doesn't make the proper contribution that they're supposed to make. All of that is, a situation that you hope don't come up. But then again, you've got to rely on that operating agreement that Abby was telling you about before, to figure out what the consequences would be. I don't know, Abby, if you have any examples of that or any scenarios of where people handle these ongoing responsibilities and potential hiccups along the way with covering costs.
Well, much of what I have to share is just based on years of practicing law and seeing a few things. And I can remember I had a client who inherited a beautiful home in Highlands, North Carolina, with his two sisters. And they each owned a third of the home. And they each got to pay a third of the expenses. And the carrying costs for this beautiful home in Highlands were a few $1 million a year. And my client never looked in the direction of the home. He never drove into North Carolina. He didn't want anything to do with it. And he said to his two sisters, "Hey, ladies, can you just buy me out of my share? Because I really don't want to keep contributing." And guess what they said? No way. They were thrilled to have him paying a third of the expenses. So I mentioned earlier that when I was practicing law, and now when clients come to talk to me about putting their home in a vacation home, there are times when it's appropriate, but I will challenge them with various questions about the home itself. And one of them, to your point, Amy, is going to be about how are we going to pay all of the expenses? And people don't really, we have smart clients, but when you have to sit down and think about all of the expenses we're talking about, right? We're talking about property taxes and insurance and maintenance. And there's always an expense that arises that's like a one-time expense, but it arose this year, and there'll be some other one-time expense that will arise next year. And, I will always talk with clients about how the funding is going to be. I have found that the easiest, simplest, most straightforward way to address this, of course, is for the people who are looking to establish this perpetual vacation home, if they can go ahead and fund it up front so that it does become that home that we talked about earlier, where it's just an enjoyable place for the family to go away and smile and make s'mores together and not have to think about the funding of the home, and just smile and think, Grandma and Grandpa put this in place for us. This is where Grandpa learned to swim, and I'm so happy to keep coming here with my children.
And I'll just add, Abby, I 100% agree with everything you just said. And I'll add that what we've seen work really well is where life insurance is coupled with a family vacation home. So if you are the matriarch or patriarch purchasing the home, and it's your hope and expectation that it will stay in the family for multiple generations, and you want to avoid a capital call situation like Amy was describing, you can purchase a second to die life insurance policy held in trust outside your estate. So all of the death benefit on that life insurance policy is free from estate tax. And it's very income tax efficient as well. And that trust can be the member of an LLC that owns the beach house. So it can provide the kitty that's like an endowment for the beach house that theoretically could last in perpetuity or at least until the underlying home was sold. I also wanted to ask Amy a follow-up question, not to put you on the spot, Amy, but in the situation that you were describing where the one cousin was doing all of the bookkeeping, have you ever seen a situation, whether it's that family or another family, where the management responsibilities were compensated?
I actually have. And in that scenario, actually, she does charge a fee. And I mean, because it is a lot of work. Now, of course, the joke is how much work is she, could be handled somewhat differently. But she does charge a fee. And I have seen that is, in particular, if you have one person who is using the property a lot or is closer to it, or is really taking over the responsibilities that maybe a property management company would take on. I'm trying to think one family that I had that did rent the property out, they paid a property manager to handle all of those rentals and to handle getting the house ready for the rentals and afterwards. And then they ended up paying one of the granddaughters to take that over for a couple of years because she was living in the neighborhood and it was a good way for her to make some money. So, I mean, it's possible, but I think it really would have to be something that the rest of the family saw as really being worth it in order to not cause hurt feelings or not cause resentments amongst them. But if they were taking the responsibility of something where they'd have to pay a property management company instead, then I think it's justified, and I've seen it work in a limited way.
So this is I think a nice transition into our next section, which is just discussing transfer planning and exit considerations. Obviously, as the sort of irony around a family vacation home is that the larger the family becomes and the success and the growth of the family and the success around how much people want to utilize and go to the vacation home, the more challenging it becomes, right? It's okay when it's mom and dad and a couple kids. It gets a little tighter when it's grandmom and granddad and two kids and their spouses, and they each have two kids. And then when you get down to the next generation, you're really bursting at the seams there. And so how do you figure out how to ensure that families, when they go to the vacation home, they're holding hands, they're not handcuffed. And part of that, I think, is taking care of the, addressing the financial aspect of it in terms of maintaining the home. But there's also individuals that have financial lives themselves, right? Each of the family members, and some family members, as Chad mentioned earlier, are going to have different financial needs than others. And so at some point, it could even be the fact that, or not the fact that that families are being divided through conflict, but it could just be that you have a family member that has fallen onto hard times or that needs the funds that may come from the sale of the vacation home. And so putting in some sort of exit planning or ways for family members to get out or to transfer in a way that still maintains the family structure and the relationships there, I think is so important. And so Kelly, I'm going to direct this question towards you, but it's really around what best practices have you seen in the past to make sure that ownership can be transferred in a way that maintains family harmony?
Thanks, Isaac. Well, Chad, not to bring it full circle, but Chad opened this webinar by talking about certain threshold topics that we address with families when they're contemplating buying the vacation home. Family goals of togetherness, putting relationships first, not letting small or perceived inequalities undermine their ultimate goals. But once we've addressed those threshold goals and shared missions, then we have to get to the nitty-gritty. And we approach this next part of the conversation as though we're advising an entrepreneur with a family business. And that might seem counterintuitive to talk about a vacation home as an operating business. We like to think of our vacations as getting away from the business. But when you own a vacation home with others, especially others in your family, you are in a business. So we step back and think about how starting a family business is different from inheriting an interest in a family business. And this all comes down to succession, of course. But when you start a business, you get to determine where the business is headquartered. You get to determine who your partners are, if any. And you get to determine the line of business itself. But when you inherit an interest in a family business, you don't. And the same is true for a vacation home. So I think it's important for, we'll call it G1, and by that I mean the matriarch or patriarch, to acknowledge that each member of G2 is either already or will one day be a matriarch or patriarch themselves. So the larger family unit is made up of lots of smaller family units. And the very goals of the family vacation home, the family togetherness, the through line among siblings and cousins, can be undermined when we don't respect each family unit within the larger family, each patch within the larger patchwork quilt that is the family. Because what happens if one or more of G2, the next generation, or even G3, decides that it doesn't want to be in the family business, doesn't want to be an owner of the family vacation home? They might live on a different coast. As Abby said earlier in her anecdotal story, they might never look in the direction of the family vacation home. Can they walk away? Is there a mechanism in place for them to walk away, or are they forever beholden to this family vacation home? Does what you had intended to be a gift or a privilege end up being handcuffs or a life sentence? And if they can walk away, are they compensated for the asset they're walking away from? Can they be bought out? And if the answer is yes, at what valuation? How do you determine the valuation? And where does the liquidity come from to buy them out? Are families who stay part of the family vacation home ownership unit, are they required to go out of pocket to buy out the ones who want to leave? That can lead to disharmony among the family. So here's where the structure and planning just becomes really, really important. And I just don't want anyone to make the mistake of thinking that this is a one-size-fits-all approach, or this isn't something that you should be speaking with your team of advisors about, who know your family and know the nuances of the situation. But generally, as a general rule, as Abby and Amy have already said, we generally recommend that vacation homes are owned in trusts or LLCs. I prefer the structure where it's an LLC owned by a trust. So the home itself is in an LLC structure, and a trust set up by the matriarch or patriarch is the owner of the LLC, and that trust might divide among G2 at the death of the survivor of the matriarch and patriarch. And that's where life insurance can be held to fund a kitty. So here are the advantages of that structure. One is liability protection, which my colleagues have already spoken about. Anybody injured on the property, water skiing accident, could only attach the assets inside the LLC. They can't reach trust assets or assets of the family. Governance, that's the big one that we've already spoken at length about. The LLC has an operating agreement, which is akin to the bylaws of a corporation. And that operating agreement dictates many things, some of which we've already spoken about, but it can dictate succession, which is the subject of the hour. So the operating agreement is not something, as Abby already said, that should be addressed lightly or skipped over. It should be addressed in detail and thought through over many meetings. But it should say at a bare minimum whether members can exit the LLC, who can be a permitted owner or member of the LLC. In other words, can one family member leave their membership interest under their will to just anybody? Can they sell their interest to just anybody? Or is it a limited class of other family members? And then also like redemption, can the LLC redeem a member's interest, buy it back? Are there puts and calls allowed? Can there be cross purchases, a purchase by one member of another member's interest? And then the operating agreement can also speak to valuation. So if the matriarch and patriarch want to discourage family members from exiting, they can place a discount on the valuation. In other words, the exiting member would not get fair market value. So those are the many succession topics that can be addressed within the operating agreement of the LLC. And then the other upside under the law as it stands today of titling an asset in an LLC, a vacation home specifically in an LLC, is that the law is very fluid right now, but as the law stands today, many states, including Maryland, the state in which I sit, allows state and local income taxes to be paid at the entity level, even for pass-through entities like LLCs. And then the SALT deductions, the state and local tax deductions at the federal level are not capped. So that's an interesting tax advantage to a vacation home being owned in an LLC structure. The disadvantages of that structure from a succession point of view are that you can't, one day when the underlying vacation home is ultimately sold, when there are so many owners that it just becomes unworkable or the goals are being undermined, and the manager of the LLC or the trustee of the trust, with the input of the family members, decide it's time to sell. If you own the vacation home in a partnership, an LLC, you can't do a 1031 exchange or a like-kind exchange to defer capital gains taxes. You can't do that with a partnership interest. You can only do that with a direct ownership interest in real estate. So unless all the partners agree, ultimately, you'd have to unwind the partnership and give each partner its own tenancy in common to do a 1031 exchange. But other than that, one small disadvantage, and then some complexity, a partnership tax return might be required. There might be some additional expense, but really those disadvantages, in my mind, are minimal compared to the advantages of the governance structure and the flexibility for succession in an LLC structure.
Thanks, Kelly.
Sure.
I'm going to, Chad, ask you sort of one more question, or maybe two questions to kind of round some of this out. We've talked a lot about, we started with the need for understanding the intent of the home and making sure we understood everyone's expectations. We talked about the putting the agreement in place, the need for the governance and the decision-making, the use, and then how all this is paid for, and then transition. Amy, did you have?
I do want to jump in real quick before
Sure.
I just wanted to mention that if you're still interested in having a family home, after all of the different reasons that we told you today, that it is something you should step into very cautiously and be very deliberate about. I just did want to mention that technology can be your friend these days, because there are some wonderful websites out there that really help people with this type of asset. When you're looking for a website like that, look for one that allows you, of course, to have the calendar. That's very important, but also allows you to keep all the governing documents in that place so that everybody can access them, that you can list the rules of engagement. From pet policies to guest policies to housekeeping policies to noise ordinances to whatever you need right there. Make sure that you have a notice board so you know what's going on at the house at all times. And then you actually can manage all the finances very transparently on a lot of these websites. So I just wanted to put a little, just say that there are ways of setting things up now through tech that can be helpful if you still decide to do something like this.
Thank you, Amy. Great point. Absolutely, technology is making things easier. Just to add on to that, the fact that we can now fairly easily rent out, second homes. That's something that is really in just sort of the last decade that it's become a viable income stream for a family vacation home. So things really are changing significantly, and so thank you for pointing that out. And Chad, just back to the kind of last wrap up question or questions here. we talked about all of this, and but I think we were looking at it from sort of the initial conversation with the family. And so I just wanted to dig in a little bit around how do families address this, at each generation, or if a family comes to you and they own it as tenants in common and they say, look, we've got this thing, we've got to figure out how to deal with it. If you could just talk to that briefly.
Yeah, it's actually a good tie-in, Isaac. I was going to mention that this is very similar, I think, to when families, if they have an existing property, it's very similar to families coming to us new with their existing estate plan. And half the battle is kind of let us in the door, let us do the analysis to understand how the document works, and then we can start kind of mapping if we need to pivot and make a change. But part of the secret sauce here, and one of the advantages of working with a firm like HB that has all these great resources, is repetition. And we try to revisit these documents oftentimes annually, but usually every 3 years, because people forget how they work. And they go through this eloquent planning and they have no idea exactly how the operating agreement works 3 years later, or why they put this asset in the LLC. So just doing that constant refresher, I think, is more than half the battle. And then it tees it up for when they bring the next generation into the discussion, because the matriarch and patriarch are fresh and they know how things work. We also just find that most families have a single point of failure. They have somebody that's the expert in the family that owns the responsibility, and the rest of the family's delegated to them. So by involving our team and letting us kind of do the documentation, do the summaries, build that financial model over and over again to make sure that it's working, that there is enough money saved. Oftentimes, we can replenish that kitty as the annual exemption amounts increase. We can replenish. So there's lots of tools that we have in the toolkit to adapt to changes. So I hope I answered that question.
And Chad, I would piggyback, just because you and I are in so many of these conversations together with families, that these are can be awkward conversations for families to have. It can be awkward to sort of honestly and transparently air grievances or talk through things in a respectful way that are highly emotional. So we can do that at family meetings. We can help facilitate those conversations. And we know the questions to ask. We know the issues that need to be spotted and addressed. So oftentimes it's just as simple as at the family meeting, we talk through how are things going, what's working, what's not working. And then, as Chad said, the reminder of the governance mechanisms.
Well, we are right at the top of the hour. So we appreciate everyone's time. I hope that everyone has gotten something out of this. One final thing to mention is that this is just the beginning of the conversation. We've just sort of scratched the surface on this. So please reach out to your advisor if you have follow-up questions. They can bring one of us in, and your advisor probably has seen this in the past as well. So please know that this is just the beginning of the conversation. Also, if you have family members or friends who are considering a vacation home, we'd be happy to talk to them and give them any insight we have around some of the best practices and some of the pitfalls that we've seen in the past. The final thing is that this is the first in a or a three-part installment around some of the topics that can impact our clients over the summer. Vacation home, this conversation was first. Next, we've got one of our partners with the property and casualty insurance company Hub International, that will be sharing some risk management insights around summer toys, travel, and fun. So boats, beach houses, international travel. That's coming up on July 16th. And then on August 27th, we have Black Cloak, which is one of our external partners that is a cybersecurity firm that works with executives and families around ensuring that that personal device and home networks are secure, and that people are putting best practices in place there. So please join us again for those. And again, if you have any follow-up questions, please reach out to your advisor, and we'll look forward to hopefully talking to some of you soon. Thank you.